You'd think, after years of camping, I'd be able to pop a tent up in minutes like those folks you see in the catalog pictures. Grinning families with their perfectly pitched shelters and not a bead of sweat on their brows. But no, every single trip proves the same thing. Setting up a tent always takes twice as long as you planned, and sometimes longer. One trip in particular stands out. An overnighter by the lake with 2 friends, a clear sky, and what should have been a simple little 2-pole dome tent. The sun was dipping low, painting the water gold, and all I could think was how nice it'd be to get the fire going before dark. But of course, the tent had other plans. We unrolled it to find the poles tangled like spaghetti and the stakes scattered in every direction. My buddy Mark swore he packed them neatly. I swore he didn't. Then came the wind. Just a steady breeze off the lake, nothing major, but enough to make the tent fabric billow like a sail every time we tried to get it upright. At one point, the whole thing took off across the clearing like it had decided to camp on its own. We chased it down, 3 grown adults scrambling after a runaway shelter like kids after a kite. When we finally wrangled it back, the ground beneath us turned out to be more rock than soil. Every stake we hammered bent sideways with a hollow ting, useless against the stubborn earth. We tried different angles, heavier rocks, even a log to pound them in. By then the sun had dropped, the air cooled, and the mosquitoes declared open season. I could feel sweat drying sticky on my neck as we fumbled with flashlights between our teeth, trying to make sense of the fabric folds and sleeve openings that never seemed to line up with the poles. That was when Mark muttered the line that stuck with me ever since. "Why does this always take twice as long as you think?" He wasn't joking. He sounded genuinely baffled, like we were the first poor souls in history to wrestle with tent poles in fading light. And maybe that's why the memory is so clear, because in that moment I realized it wasn't just us. It's the eternal curse of camping. The tent will always win the first round. By the time we finally got the first pole threaded through, my flashlight was dimming to a weak glow. I could barely make out Mark's silhouette cursing up. We tried to connect the second pole. No matter how we angled it, the ends just wouldn't snap into their grommets. One side would pop out the moment we bent the other into place. It was like wrestling a stubborn animal that refused to be tamed. At one point, I was practically lying on my back in the dirt, feet braced against the ground, pushing the pole forward with both hands while Mark tried to slot the end into its pocket. It slipped loose with a twang, and the recoil snapped against my knuckle hard enough to make me see stars. Jenna laughed so hard she nearly doubled over. Meanwhile, the mosquitoes were relentless. They whined around our ears, landed on our necks, and bit through our shirts. I slapped at them so much that my arms looked like I'd been playing patty cake with a porcupine. Mark eventually gave up trying to swat them, muttering, "They can have me," like he was offering himself up as a sacrifice so the rest of us could work in peace. It only got worse when a gust of wind came barreling off the lake. The half-assembled tent caught it like a parachute and yanked right out of our hands. This time it didn't just tumble a few feet. It rolled clear across the clearing, gathering speed until it smacked into a clump of brush and stuck there. We stood in stunned silence for a moment, then all 3 of us ran after it, stumbling over rocks and roots in the dark, swearing and laughing in equal measure. When we dragged it back again, tangled in twigs and leaves, the fabric was damp with dew and smelled faintly of crushed grass. We finally decided to slow down and regroup. Sitting on the ground, sweaty and itchy and thoroughly exasperated, I couldn't help but chuckle. "You know," I said, "if we just lay the tent flat and sleep on top, it'll be the fastest setup we've ever done." Jenna actually considered it for a moment, then shook her head. "No way. I'm not waking up with spiders in my hair." And so, with the night closing in around us and the campfire still unlit, we squared our shoulders for round 2 of the battle against the tent. Round 2 began with a bit more determination and a lot less pride. We spread the tent out flat again, brushing off the grass. Seconds. It stood on its own. We all stared at it in disbelief, like we'd just invented fire. Then came the stakes. Remember that rocky ground? Still there, still just as uncooperative. I hammered one in, only to have it bend like a cheap fork. Jenna tried the next and hit nothing but stone. After a few more failures, Mark suggested using rocks to weigh down the corners instead of staking them. It wasn't elegant, but at that point, I would have agreed to tying the thing to a tree with my shoelaces if it meant we could crawl inside. So, we gathered rocks, big ones, flat ones, anything heavy enough to keep the tent from taking off again. By the time we had all four corners secured, the tent looked less like a cozy dome and more like some kind of strange archaeological dig covered in tarps. Still, it was upright, and in that moment, it was beautiful. We stood there, in the dim glow of our flashlights, sweat cooling on our necks, dirt smeared on our knees, and bug bites blooming red across our arms. No one spoke. It was like we were afraid that if we acknowledged our success out loud, the tent would collapse in rebellion. Finally, Jenna whispered, "It's standing." Mark nodded solemnly, like we'd just witnessed a sacred ritual. And then, as if to remind us who was really in charge, another gust of wind rattled through the clearing. The tent shook violently, its fabric snapping like sails on a stormy sea. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to lift off again. We lunged forward, each grabbing a side, holding it down with every ounce of strength. After a long, tense pause, the wind died, and the tent sagged back into place. We didn't cheer, didn't laugh. We just sat down around it like weary soldiers after a battle. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we weren't about to let it get away again. Just when we thought the battle was won, the tent had one last trick to play on us. We unzipped the flap, eager to finally crawl inside and call it a victory. But as soon as I swung my out across the floor to make a sort of patchwork padding, it wasn't perfect, but at least it took the edge off the worst of the roots. By the time we were done, the inside of the tent looked like a rummage sale, but it was marginally sleepable. Of course, just as we finished arranging our bedding, the first drop of rain hit the roof. One, then two, then a steady patter that quickly grew into a downpour. We all froze, staring upward as if sheer willpower could hold back the storm. The good news? The tent didn't collapse. The bad news? Whoever had last packed it away hadn't remembered to tuck in the rainfly correctly. Water started seeping through one corner, dripping onto Mark's sleeping bag. He scrambled to move it, bumping into Jenna, who yelled as cold drops splattered onto her pillow. I tried to fix the fly from inside, fumbling blindly at the damp fabric, but all I managed to do was soak my own sleeve. So there we were, 3 tired campers huddled in a half-wet tent, surrounded by rocks and roots, with rain hammering above us and mosquitoes whining just outside the thin walls. It should have felt miserable, and maybe it did in the moment. But somewhere between the laughter, the swearing, and the sheer absurdity of it all, I felt something else too. That strange, stubborn joy you only get when things go completely wrong, and you realize you'll laugh about it later. We ended up pushing our bags together in the driest corner, shoulder to shoulder, whispering jokes and muffled complaints as the storm rolled on. The tent might have beaten us in every way imaginable, but it was holding, barely, and that was enough. Morning came not with birdsong, but with the groan of 3 stiff campers trying to sit up in a tent that looked like it had survived a barroom brawl. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving everything damp and smelling faintly of wet earth and smoke. My back felt like it had been introduced to every root and rock in the clearing, and Mark's hair stuck up at angles I didn't think humanly possible. Jenna just lay there for a long minute, staring at the sagging ceiling with the kind of hollow-eyed express. Breakfast, we gnawed on granola bars, too tired to bother with anything more complicated. Nobody said much for a while, just chewed in silence, each of us stealing occasional glances at the sorry state of our shelter. Finally, Jenna broke the quiet. "You know, if we just started earlier, or read the instructions, or picked a better spot, or brought a different tent," Mark cut in. "Or a cabin," I added, deadpan. We all laughed, weak but genuine, and that laughter did what the tent couldn't, and held everything together. Because in the end, it didn't matter how crooked or soggy that little dome was. What mattered was that it had been ours for the night. A shared struggle, a shared joke, a story none of us would forget. As we packed up later, I found myself brushing off the bent stakes and folding the tent with more care than it deserved. It struck me then that maybe that's the whole point of camping. Things rarely go smoothly, but it's the bumps and blunders that make the best stories. Fires burn low, winds get wild, tents misbehave, and we walk away with memories stronger than anything polished or perfect could ever give us. So now, every time I drag out a tent and brace myself for the inevitable fight, I remember that night by the lake. The struggle will always take twice as long as I think, maybe longer. But I know, deep down, that's exactly what makes it worth the trouble.